A few weeks ago, I asked the question, what would Pokemon look like if it only had 4 stats? In that video, I mostly covered how it would affect individual Pokemon, but in this video, I want to look at how it would affect a metagame as a whole. This video was brought to you by the members of the Crustacean Association, Finnegan Cleary and Aidan Tawney. If you'd like to join them and help support the channel even more, it would be greatly appreciated. If you haven't watched the last video, I'll recap how I created the 4 types. The 4 or more likely 3 formulas that you see on the screen right now are the ways in which I decided to create these new types. Essentially, the defensive stats have been split up between HP and what I'm calling the general stats. This way, Pokemon can kind of keep the roles that they filled before, however it does bring all Pokemon a little bit closer together. I have made a few changes, mainly around how I'm treating different forms. In the last video, I kept the HP stat of all forms the same. This is mainly because when a Pokemon changes form, they very rarely have a change in HP. The only one I can think of is Zygarde. This meant that a lot of forms specifically lost defensive ability, with the biggest culprit being Wishiwashi. Wishiwashi's very low defenses in its base form, compared to its very high defenses in its alternate form, meant that even when in its alternate form, it's still a very weak Pokemon in this metagame. This is because its good defenses were only really being counted for half of what they were, as it wasn't impacting the HP where the other half of the defenses go. On the other hand, Pokemon who are much more defensive in their base form, like Minior or Aegislash, would retain that through having a much higher HP, even though it should be considerably lower when in their attacking versions. I've since made a U-turn on how I wanted to tackle this, as I think it would be much better if they had the form changes affect their HP as well. So they keep the same percentage of HP that they have, but now they gain a different max HP. It would be kind of weird in how it works in battle, but Zygarde Complete does something very similar, and I think it would be a better compromise than having these weird stats that kind of overlap each other. This would also apply to form changes outside of battle, where it would be much easier to have these changes. This means that a Pokemon like Deoxys Defense would actually be defensive, whereas before it would just be a worse version of all the other Deoxyses. I don't know if Deoxyses or Deoxy is the correct way of pluralizing that word, but I don't know, how would you say it? Another change I wanted to make was how I handled speed. Speed was the only stat that I hadn't changed, and a lot of people suggested that I implement the crit rate mechanic from Generation 1. In Generation 1, crit rate was based on base speed, but I think that you can do it a little bit differently, and this is based on comparative speed rather than base speed. I think it makes quite a bit of sense, as a fast Pokemon would have a really good chance at hitting a weak spot on a much slower Pokemon, as they can outmaneuver them and are a bit more agile. At first, I considered going off the stages of crit rate that you have, so moves like Night Slash that have a +1, or Focus Energy that gives you a +2 to crit, but then I realised that with the brackets that I had created, Regieleki would be having a half chance to hit a critical hit against most other Pokemon, because it is just so much faster than every other Pokemon. I eventually decided on these 5 tiers for the crit chances. As you can see, Pokemon who are far slower hit crits a lot less compared to Pokemon who are much faster than their opponents. Regieleki still hits that higher bracket most of the time, with it still hitting 150% speed against most Pokemon. I also didn't know this about Pokemon, but if you're at max friendship, you also get a double bonus to your crit chance, which seems really unique. I never realized that once you use Focus Energy and then have max friendship, you can hit like half of your moves are going to be crits all the time. Like, I never knew that that's how it worked. But that would still apply to these new changes. So Regieleki, at that max speed, when it hits that max critical chance, it would then have about a 1/6 chance of hitting a critical hit on any move that it has. Talking about max speed, I think EVs would have to work differently. Currently you get 510 EVs that you can distribute amongst all of your stats, but if you only have 4 stats, surely you should have far less EVs. 340 is 2/3 of 510, so let's go with that as the new base for EVs. This would make them much more valuable for Pokemon, as you can only fully invest in a single stat. You have to really decide which of your 4 stats is going to be the one that you want to put all of your eggs in. It's also going to be really interesting seeing how natures are going to work in this, because obviously now every stat is more important than just the one thing that they did previously. I don't think you'll see many speed drop in natures, but if you're lowering, let's say, your special, you're also lowering your special defense, or if you're lowering your physical, you're also lowering your physical defense. So they have much more of a drawback compared to just lowering the attacking stat you aren't using. The final change I have is actually a correction in which I talked about abilities like huge power and ice scales in the last video. I said that these were modifiers to stats, but having had it pointed out in the comments, and since looking into it, I now realise that I was wrong, and that they're actually modifiers to damage. The reason why I thought this is because all of the flavor text in Pokemon makes it seem as though that is the case. I really wish that this was something that Pokemon didn't do, and that they actually gave us some better definitions for how some things work in the game. This to me makes it seem as though it doubles attack, when actually it doesn't. It just provides a damage modifier that is a double in the actual calculation. This actually works out much better, as it means that things like huge power aren't affecting how much a Pokemon will take defensively, meaning that the Pokemon that have huge power won't become amazing defensive Pokemon as well. This applies for a bunch of different things. I'm just going to list them all on here because there are a lot of them, but it includes some items like the choice items and then a few abilities. So there is the admin completed. Form changes now change HP, crits are based on variations in speed, Pokemon have less EVs to play with, and modifiers stay as modifiers. But how would this affect the metagame? My initial thought is that boosted moves would become absolutely vital to how the metagame works. These moves become incredibly powerful, but I don't think that they'll become completely broken just because of how widely available they are. If everyone is overpowered, then no one is. That said, some Pokemon will be better than others. Kartana has the highest physical stat in the game, outside of any extra forms, and combined with its decent speed for landing more crits, and its access to higher crit moves anyway, it's going to be a really powerful Pokemon. It has access to Swords Dance, which would give it a +2 in physical, making it an amazing wall breaker. Mega Alakazam is very similar, essentially being a slightly weaker but faster special variant that can't hold an item. I imagine these two would be some of the most powerful Pokemon in the game, just because of how much damage they can do after they set up just a single boost, or even without a single boost. They do have the downside of being entirely invested into a single side of the spectrum, which means that they would be very vulnerable, especially Mega Alakazam, who has to deal with most of the priority in the game. But if it was under something like Psychic Terrain, it would become incredibly powerful, being hard to outspeed, and being hard to take a hit from. Whilst these are two Pokemon who have really high stats and stood out to me for that reason, there are some Pokemon who stand out because they have amazing moves that translate really well. Cotton Guard and Tail Glow both provide a +3 to one of the general stats, something which is going to be incredibly powerful. For Cotton Guard users, I imagine that Mega Banette would easily be the best version. It has a really high physical and a really good ghost typing, which means that it would be incredibly powerful and hard to resist. After a single boost, it would deal a ridiculous amount of damage with moves like Poltergeist or Knockoff, and I think the only things that hold it back are its relatively poor speed and lack of a fighting type physical move. It would just be a complete nuke of a Pokemon. You could also do the same idea with Mega Altaria, who with a moveset of Cotton Guard, Double Edge, Outrage, and Earthquake would be an absolute monster, especially those pixelate double edges. You could probably swap out Outrage for something like Roost, just to make it so that you can fire off even more of those mega powerful double edges. I think the rest of the Pokemon who learn Cotton Guard are either not interested in being physical attackers, or they're just generally too weak to be viable in a top tier, but I could definitely see one or both of these being banned from competitive play. On the special side, Tail Glow Xurkitree is very much like Cotton Guard Mega Banette. They're incredibly powerful and can throw off some really strong moves, but they are somewhat limited by poor speed and not very good all-round stats. I still think it would be a very powerful Pokemon, but I think it could be kept in check. Manaphy, on the other hand, is a complete all-rounder, being able to specialize however it wants. It can work on rain teams as a bulky Pokemon, or it can be much more offensive. It actually also gains access to Acid Armor and Tail Glow, meaning that it can basically become a Pokemon that has no downsides, especially in rain with that rest and hydration recovery. You would just have such a complete all-rounder, and not a jack of all trades, master of none scenario. It's a jack of all trades, master of everything. So I would think it would definitely be banned. With all of these powerful attacking, boosting threats, I think you would have a much faster metagame, where if you can get into a situation where you can boost, you can basically win the game straight from there. So many Pokemon become uncontrollable with these really powerful boosts, and I don't think the defensive Pokemon will be able to keep up. The exception to this is the Pokemon with the ability Unaware. A Pokemon like Dondozo is going to be a very good physical wall with its naturally high physical and HP, whereas Pokemon like Clefable or Quagsire have never really relied on one specific outlier stat to be very good defensive Pokemon. I do think a Pokemon like Clodsire could drop off in viability, as its stats are much more min-maxed, and they lead to a worse stat spread. With all of the powerful boosts going around, I think Unaware Pokemon will be a guarantee on every single team. You basically need to have them or you will just get swept from turn 1. Because of how I've converted the stats, in general, Pokemon are going to be a lot more balanced in how their stats are laid out. This means that you get less Pokemon like Blissey or Pheromosa, who are purely defensive and offensive respectively. Every Pokemon now becomes a bit more of a jack of all trades. Because of this, I don't think Stall would be a very viable strategy in this metagame. Whilst some staples of Stall would still be good, a lot of them become a lot more general in how their stats are laid out. And you also have to deal with mega powerful boosters, as I've talked about before, and probably an increase in critical hits from offensive Pokemon who are generally quicker against these slower stall Pokemon. On the topic of Blissey, it's probably one of the worst victims of the changes that we've made. Most of its bulk comes from its ridiculously high HP, but now it's being watered down by its absolutely terrible defense. This means that it doesn't gain a ridiculous amount of special attack, but it loses out considerably on HP, and I just don't think that it would be a very good Pokemon in this scenario, especially as the metagame would be much more in favour of attacking Pokemon. I'll also talk about Shuckle, as that's another Pokemon that is super min-maxed. It gains considerably in HP due to its amazing defences, but I think in general it looks way too weak to be any kind of good Pokemon. Thank you to the viewer who suggested a great way for how Shell Smash could work. I couldn't work it out in the last video, but from what I think they said, this is what I got. It would provide a +2 to every single stat at the cost of 2/3 of your health. This essentially keeps the idea of it being a high risk, high reward move, as you have to play the rest of the game with just 1/3 of your health. You might think that this is a little bit too low, but this is to factor in that the Shell Smash boost does actually now factor in its defenses. Some of the Pokemon who I think would be really good are the Pokemon that had really high defensive stats. Pokemon with ridiculously high defenses tend to also have ridiculously high attacks. This means that Pokemon like Aggron or Stack Attacker have really high physicals and a decent HP to them. Mega Aggron has one of the highest physicals in the entire game, and with its access to Iron Defense, which is essentially an Iron Defense and a Sword Stance in one move, a good typing and filter, I think it would be one of the best Pokemon. It does have a few drawbacks like being really slow or having no healing moves, but I think it would be a very powerful Pokemon. Healing is something as well that would become much more common, and I think you could see a few really good bulky attackers become very good. The reason why healing would become much more common is how I've decided to change moves like Bulk Up, Calm Mind or Quiver Dance. As these moves buff 2 of these stats that have become the new general stats, the way I've decided to handle them is by increasing the general stat by 1 stage and then also providing a small heal, something like 1/4. This way it keeps these moves different from Amnesia or Sword Stance, but it also means that they're not losing out, as their defense now is partially represented by their HP. A lot of really good Pokemon who lack healing would gain access to these moves, with Pokemon like Great Tusk and Landorus on a physical side, and Pokemon like Mega Diancie and Tapu Lele being on the special side. Speaking of Mega Diancie, I think it could be an absolutely brilliant Pokemon. Its really high defenses and its really high offensive stats make up for its poor HP, and it just becomes a great all-rounder with a really good speed as well. It has access to both Iron Defense and Amnesia, meaning that similar to Manaphy, it can boost pretty much all of its stats. Draining Kiss is another option for healing that it has. I just think it would become a really strong Pokemon. Obviously, I haven't been able to name every single Pokemon that I think is good. If there's enough demand for it, I might look into it even more to see if there's any more Pokemon who I think would become really good. But can you think of any at the moment? If you have enjoyed this video or would like to see more from this specific topic, please leave a like or even consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you.